concept behind the existing statute on these matters is that gun rights are not like other rights. They're foundational and essential, and that it's important for policy to be consistent across the state. If this bill passes, is there a risk that local jurisdictions will want to extend this concept to more strict restrictions and local policies on other foundational rights, like the right to peaceably assemble for the common good and the right to not be disturbed in your personal affairs? Do you see that it could drift that direction?
I don't see it as a slippery slope, but I do see the Constitution is not a suicide pact. It's a balancing act. We constantly have to balance the rights of people that are enforcing their constitutional protections against the others. And so even with the Second Amendment is broad enough to allow for reasonable gun regulations, particularly to protect communities that are under a siege of gun violence and crime.
We've heard mention already in testimony on a previous bill here today that mention of the Bruin decision, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision. And that decision described legislation, proposals like this, and if passed into law, state laws like this, that rely on what legal scholars consider a two-step analysis or two-part justification for the policy. And the Bruin decision, the U.S. Supreme Court said that that two-part balancing test has one part too many and has turned away analogous laws like this. How do you think this proposal squares with that Bruin decision?
I'm certainly not a constitutional attorney, nor an attorney at all, but I believe in the legal minds that helped craft this in the Attorney General's office. I believe it's on sound constitutional footing. I think other similar laws across the country have been upheld in courts, and I think that is the process that we can go through. Will there be a challenge? Absolutely, and I welcome that challenge. And I think that is one of the things that we get to do in state government is, we are the petri dish of discovering these laws, and this is, I think, an honest attempt to see if we can, in fact, constitutionally stem the tide of gun violence.
And you kind of dodged the question a little bit there. Yes, the historic tradition of this nation in regulating firearms, and we use regulating in the 18th century notion of that word, is the standard test. But this policy relies on a public good, as we've heard in testimony, that is the step that the U.S. Supreme Court specifically rejected in Bruin. So, to my point, how does this proposal survive the Bruin standard there?
Well, as I said, the Bruin standard, part of that standard is examining whether the law is consistent with the nation's history and tradition of regulating firearms. There is a robust history and tradition of regulating firearms to protect public safety, and this bill is consistent with that tradition. Just as an example, the Supreme Court has expressly said fully automatic weapons like M16s are not protected by the Second Amendment, and we believe that this bill is consistent with that line of precedent.
I know you're pinch hitting, so I'm not going to drill into the details of terribly technical matters, but let's do a thought experiment for these proposals, these two bills. The comparison's been made in that statement to a fishing license or a driver's license, which of course are not specifically protected under the state constitution or federal constitution. Voting is specifically protected under the state constitution and federal constitution. Would it be, the logic of this bill suggests we can require training and a permit to exercise the constitutionally protected right to keep and bear firearms. Following the logic of these bills, would it be reasonable to request training and a permit to vote?
Thank you for the question. I think this is the fundamental you get to the crux of the question, right? I think I read that when the Constitution was crafted that it took 1 minute and 42 seconds to reload a musket. And so we're in a place where what we think of as constitutionally protected activity has far outstripped the vision of our founding fathers, and it is reasonable to in this day and age to regulate dangerous objects, and so we have to balance rights with responsibilities. And so I do think we need to regulate voting as well and balance rights and responsibilities there too. But it's an excellent question. Thank you, Representative Walsh.